Book 2, The Aethel-Cradle. Chapter 1, The Awakening of Iron. Act 1, The Phantom Limb. The universe did not return with light. It returned with the smell of scorched wire and chemical formaldehyde. Commander Valen tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids did not respond. Instead, a series of cold, emerald data strings began to scroll downward across his darkness. They were written in the sharp, bureaucratic font of the Directorate's industrial priesthood, not the holy, flowing runes of the sovereignty he had looked at for 200 years. System boot sequence initializing. Neural link. Stable. 98% match. Host biomass. Integrated/cauterized. Chassis. Identifier. Unit-01-EG-Phi. AELEN. Current status. Standby/involuntary compliance active. He tried to draw a breath, but there were no lungs to expand. In their place, a mechanical bellow hissed deep within his chest, a low, rhythmic pumping that tasted of stale ozone and liquid copper. He tried to raise his right arm, the arm that had swung the Sunder Hammer through the blood of Hivekeep 9, but the signal inside his brainstem warped. He didn't feel bone and muscle. He felt the cold, heavy potential of a 300-pound slab of cast iron. Subject is showing localized neural activity, a flat, synthesized voice click-clacked through the darkness. It was a technician's voice, filtered through a dozen copper vox emitters. Increase the lethe serum drip by 3%. The asset's central nervous system is fighting the calibration. Do not drown the brain, scribe. A colder, more elegant voice replied from further away. It was a woman's voice, sharp as a razor, carrying the absolute authority of the High Spires. The High Auditor requires the Knight Commander's cognitive core to remain sharp. A dull blade cannot lead the harvest. With a brutal electric snap, Valen's optical sensors flamed to life. The world was upside down. He was suspended 5 feet above a cold iron deck plates, his heavy gunmetal gray limbs locked into a massive circular calibration frame. Thick black hydraulic tethers ran from his spine into the ceiling tracks, pulsing with a pale gray formatting fluid. He wasn't in his ancient brass Aegis carapace anymore. That holy armor had been stripped away, broken down for scrap in the foundries. He had been cast into the very shape of the monsters they had fought below. He was an iron-skinned. Act 2. The Gantry of the Damned. Valen rotated his optical lens, the motor clicking softly as it focused on the calibration frames to his left and right. In the frame next to him hung Thrain. The heavy specialist's chassis was even more monstrous than Valen's. His right arm had been completely removed from the shoulder down, replaced by a massive, blocky kinetic forearm cannon that was still weeping yellow formatting oil onto the deck. His head was encased in a smooth, featureless iron plate, save for a solitary, unblinking green optical slot that flickered weakly in the dark. To Valen's right was Cassian. The young Knight Scribe's frame was shivering violently, the hydraulic fluid leaking from his knee joints as his central nervous system actively rejected the compliance tethers. A thick steel compliance collar was clamped over his jaw, its internal magnetic rings vibrating at a high frequency to suppress his sub-vocal prayers. "Look at them," the High Auditor murmured, stepping into Valen's line of sight. She was a creature of the High Spires, her body hidden beneath sweeping robes of white porcelain silk. her face entirely concealed by an unpolished brass mask shaped to look like a sightless eye. Her hands were skeletal clusters of copper needles that twitched in time with the data streams projecting from her wrist arrays. "3 relics of a dying empire," she said, her brass mask reflecting the emerald light of Valen's visor. "You thought you were saving the girl when you stole that shuttle from Hive Keep 9. You thought you were escaping into the void. But every path in this sector leads to the Aethel-Cradle. We do not waste material here, Commander. We optimize it." She stepped closer, her needle fingers tapping lightly against the center of Valen's gunmetal chest plate, right over the stamped serial number. Unit 01EGVAELEN. "The girl, Lyra, is already inside the Weaver chambers," the auditor whispered, her voice layered with a clinical, unbothered cruelty. "Her mind is being woven into our primary navigation grid as we speak. And you three will be the vanguard that protects her cradle. You will be the hounds that herd the remaining 5 sectors into the stasis grinders." She turned away, her porcelain silk robes sweeping over the greasy floor. "Begin the final welding sequence. Weld the plates to the marrow. Act 3. The internal liturgy." The automated welding drones dropped from the gantry tracks like mechanical spiders, their blue laser cutters whining as they approached Valen's leg plates. Valen didn't scream. He had no vocal cords to scream with. But inside the dark, isolated vault of his remaining human mind, he reached out for the old connection. "Thrain," Valen sent a localized short-range data pulse through the neural mesh. It was a raw, uncalibrated burst that bypassed the Directorate's security filters through sheer willpower. "Thrain, report." A long second of static followed. Then Thrain's heavy sub-bass rumble crackled through the link. The cannon isn't loaded, Commander. But the weight is there. If I can drop the frame, I can smash the deck." "Hold your fire until the scribe is ready," Valen pulsed back. Cassian, do you hear me?" From the right frame, a chaotic, broken signal flooded the link. It wasn't data. It was a rhythmic, breathless chant, vibrating with a terrifying, ecstatic fanaticism that the compliance caller could not suppress. "Iron may bend. The flesh may burn." Cassian's mind voice was a bleeding, frantic thing inside the network. "But the soul belongs to the throne." "Cassian, stop feeding their grid," Valen ordered. "They are tracking your spikes." Chapter 2. Let them track it. The red line, Cassian whispered back. Act 1. His red, bloodshot eyes opening behind his cracked The ventilation shafts of processing block the 7 were not built for men. They think they were built for the thundering exhaust of the casting furnaces. They don't know the weight of the hammer. Led the way through the horizontal steel square. I will blow the gunmetal shoulders, shearing sparks off the riveted walls of the welding drones. Behind him came Cassian, gripping a stolen industrial plasma cutter like a sword, and Thrain, whose uncalibrated forearm and the ancient, clinged heavily against the deck with every lunging crawl. They had been remade into the enemy's tools, a continuous pneumatic roar that vibrated through their breastplates. The main elevator lines are locked down, Cassian rasped over the short-range comms, his voice competing with the mechanical rushing. "Unbind. The auditor knows we're out of our frames. If we don't clear this shaft in 30 seconds, they'll vent the plasma exhaust and roast us in our skin." "They won't vent it," Valen muttered, his ocular visor tracking a heavy structural vibration through the floor mesh. "Look down. We have company." Beneath the heavy steel grating of their shaft ran a primary logistics corridor, a high-speed vacuum-sealed transit tube used by the Directorate to move heavy military hardware across the station's sectors. A high-pitched magnetic whine echoed from the dark tunnel ahead. It was a Directorate security skiff, a low, flat-backed steel platform floating on magnetic fields, loaded with crate wells of heavy ordnance, and manned by 3 automated security drones and a human overseer wearing a matte black tactical visor. "Going down!" Valen roared. The commander didn't look for a latch. He brought his newly recovered Sunderhammer down with a localized gravity strike that pulverized the steel floor grating into twisted wire. 900 pounds of gunmetal gray plasteel plunged through the hole, dropping 12 feet directly onto the bed of the speeding mag transport. The platform tilted violently under the kinetic impact, its magnetic stabilization rings screaming as they fought the sudden weight. Before the security drones could rotate their weapon mounts, Valen swung. The hammer, fed by the stolen power cell, swept in a horizontal blur. The kinetic shockwave didn't just smash the 2 leading drones, it threw their shattered, sparking chassis off the side of the platform, where they hit the tunnel walls at 200 miles per hour, exploding into a shower of black grease and magnesium fire. Cassian and Thrain dropped down beside him a second later. The human overseer, panicked, slammed his hand onto the transport's primary throttle, overriding the safety governors. The skiff lurched forward with a brutal, spine-snapping acceleration, rocketing out of the transit tube and into the sprawling, multi-tiered industrial canyons of the station's main logistical hub. Act 2, the high-speed choke. "We're redlining," Thrain bellowed, his boots throwing blue sparks off the platform as he braced his massive frame against the wind. The chase was frantic. The skiff tore through the multi-mile-wide canyon, weaving between massive, swinging crane hooks and towering automated sorting arms that dropped from the ceiling like iron executioners. Behind them, 2 lightweight Directorate intercept bikes dropped from the high gantries, their twin rotary lasers cutting lines of molten slag across the transport's rear cargo crates. "Cassian, take the helm," Valen ordered, leaning over the side to smash an incoming security drone that tried to board from a maintenance platform. Cassian lunged over the console, his plasma cutter slicing clean through the overseer's weapon arm before the man could fire his sidearm. He grabbed the manual steering yoke, his bloodshot eyes widening with a fanatical grin as the bright orange glare of the furnace rivers flashed across his faceplates. "By the Saint's blade, we fly!" Cassian laughed, a manic bleeding sound as he pulled the yoke hard to the left. The mag transport drifted sideways at a terrifying angle, its magnetic undercarriage scraping the lip of a massive brass pipe that bled superheated steam. The friction sent a wall of white sparks 40 feet into the air, blinding the pursuing intercept bikes. One of the bikes miscalculated the drift, clipping the edge of a structural pillar and turning into a spectacular tumbling ball of burning fuel that rained down into the lower cargo bays. "Thrain, clear the second line," Valen yelled. Thrain stepped to the rear of the skiff, raising his massive, uncalibrated forearm cannon. He didn't have a targeting reticle. The Directorate hadn't finished wiring his weapon link. "Too heavy for aim," Thrain grunted, his voice a rhythmic metal slamming. "I'll just use the spread." He pulled the manual trigger wire. The heavy cannon didn't fire a single shell. It unleashed a deafening, localized burst of tungsten buckshot that chewed through the air like a localized storm. The remaining intercept bike was peppered by 50 high-velocity rounds, its engine block instantly shredding and throwing the rider over the handlebars into the dark abyss of the understation. "Core breach ahead!" Cassian shouted, slamming his hand onto the emergency magnetic brakes. The transit tube was ending, terminating at a massive, triple-locked security bulkhead. The skiff's magnetic rings reversed polarity with a scream that sounded like tearing metal. throwing the three knights forward against the console as the platform ground to a smoking, screeching halt just inches from the iron wall. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the overheated engines and the ragged, bloody breathing of Cassian. Violin stepped off the platform, his hammer resting on his shoulder. He looked at the bulkhead door. It wasn't standard directorate slate. It was covered in jagged, hand-painted red lines, the primitive script of the sovereignty's old border. "This door wasn't locked from the outside," Valen said, pointing his visor at the heavy weld lines running along the iron seams. "It was sealed from within." Act 3. The Forgotten Guerrillas. Before Cassian could raise his plasma cutter to breach the gate, a sharp metallic click echoed from the shadows of the surrounding maintenance catwalks. Dozens of low-intensity chemical flares ignited simultaneously, casting a flickering blood-red light over the corridor. From behind the rusted oil drums and structural pillars stepped a small army. They weren't iron-skinned. They weren't wearing the slick uniforms of the Directorate. They were human. They were the survivors of the core worlds, citizens who had escaped the mass stasis harvest by fleeing into the deep, unmonitored labyrinth of the station's plumbing and structural layers. They looked like ghosts. Their skin was deathly pale from years of lightless survival, their clothes a patchwork of greasy industrial rags and pieces of scavenged flak armor. But their weapons were real. They held heavy modified rivet guns, chemical flamethrowers, and old-pattern sovereignty kinetic rifles, all aimed squarely at the three knights. "Step away from the gate, machine meat," a voice called out from the darkness. Out stepped a woman. She was small, one side of her face heavily scarred by a chemical burn, her eyes sharp and hard as flint. She wore the tattered coat of a sovereignty logistics captain, and her hand was steady on the grip of a heavy double-barreled scattergun aimed directly at Valen's visor. "We saw your dropship crash on the fringe," she said, her voice a low, bitter rasp. "We thought you were holy knights. We thought the Aegis had finally come to save us, but look at you now, just more gunmetal gray, just more of the Auditor's pets, come to drag us to the grinders." Cassian stepped forward, his chest plates heaving, his face bleeding from his destroyed collar. "We are the Spear of St. Jarl. We serve the throne, not the Directorate's furnace, woman." The rebels didn't lower their weapons. A few of them laughed, a dry, hollow, hopeless sound that rattled through the rusted pipes. "The throne can't hear you down here, boy," the captain said, her finger tightening on her trigger. "The Auditor has been burning 100,000 of us a day to keep the lights on. There are only 5,000 of us left in the dark. We are fighting a war against a machine that eats our children to make its bullets, and we are losing. If you're here to take what's left, you'll have to burn every single one of us to do it." Valen looked at her, then down at his own stamped serial number on his chest. Unit 01EG Valen. He realized the tragedy of their position. To the survivors, they looked exactly like the monsters that had stolen their lives. He slowly lowered his sunder hammer, planting the head firmly on the deck plates. "We aren't here to harvest you, Captain," Valen rumbled, his deep, mechanical voice softening into that ancient, commanding baritone. "We are here for the girl in the high spire, and if your war is with the Auditor, then our hammers belong to your line." Chapter 3. The Ascent Through the Blood Pipes. Act 1. The Hydraulic Labyrinth. The entry point to the high spires did not look like an elevator. It looked like an open, dripping artery. Captain Sabine, the scarred rebel leader, led the squad down into the depths of the sanguine conduit network. This was the literal plumbing of the Aethel-Cradle, a subterranean web of miles-wide iron-insulated pipelines that pumped the liquefied biological components from the stasis harvest blocks directly up to the Weaver Matrix and the automated casting foundries. The environment was a sensory nightmare. The air was thick, humid, and smelled heavily of copper and chemically treated formaldehyde. Environment data, internal pipelines. Ambient temp, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius. Fluid composition, organic calcium, iron-rich hemoglobin, stasis, amniotic fluid. Pressure, status, high/intermittent pulsing. The Directorate uses the main structural lifts to move their iron-skinned troops, Sabine said, her voice echoing hollowly through her patched rebreather mask as she climbed onto a wet, rusted iron catwalk. But they don't guard the primary fluid lines. They assume nobody is crazy enough to swim through the slurry. We aren't swimming, Thrain rumbled, his massive, uncalibrated kinetic cannon clinking heavily against the curved steel wall of the pipe. The weight of our new chassis will drop us to the bottom like stones. You won't have to swim if we catch the surge cycle right, Sabine replied, pointing her chemical flare into the dark, yawning cavern of a vertical pipeline. Every 20 minutes, the lower processing blocks flush the raw biomass upward to the refinery spires. The pressure lifts the fluid through an internal piston system. We ride the maintenance service capsules inside the primary valves. But if we miss the timing, we get crushed by 500 tons of liquefied human remains, Cassian finished, his bloodshot eyes reflecting the dim orange glow of the chemical flare. He let out a low, unsettling laugh that rattled his broken compliance collar. A fitting baptism for a crusade. Act 2. The pressure surge. The squad and a half-dozen of Sabine's vanguard crammed into a rusted, cage-like service capsule bolted to the interior wall of Conduit Theta. It was a vertical cylinder, 4 stories wide, extending miles into the dark ceiling above. Thump. Thump, thump. Hold on to the frame, Sabine yelled, locking her harness straps with white-knuckled grip. The surge is coming. With a deafening, wet roar, the bottom of the conduit opened. A towering wall of thick, deep crimson fluid, the chemically preserved essence of 100,000 processed citizens, rushed up from the depths. The sheer kinetic force of the hydraulic surge hit the bottom of their service capsule, slamming the 3 heavy knights against the steel roof with a brutal, bone-jarring impact. Chassis, structural integrity, 88%. External pressure, critical. The capsule began to rocket upward, propelled entirely by the massive volume of fluid rising beneath it. Through the iron mesh of the cage, the world was a churning, violent vortex of dark red slurry. The friction of the liquid against the outer walls of the pipe created a high-pitched, shrieking hiss that vibrated directly through the knight's neural links. The pressure valve ahead isn't opening, Cassian roared over the short-range comms, his visor tracking the automated security gate approaching rapidly from above. The Directorate's automated systems had detected a density anomaly in Conduit Theta. A massive 3-tiered iron iris valve was rotating shut, intending to trap and purge the fluid to prevent a backup. If the iris closed completely, the rising column of liquid would compress their capsule into a scrap metal pancake. Thrain, the cannon, Valen commanded, his heavy boots locked into the floor mesh as the capsule spun violently in the bloody torrent. Thrain didn't have time to calibrate. He jammed his blocky, modified forearm cannon through the top bars of the cage, pointing it directly at the center of the closing iron iris. Manual override. Fire, Thrain grunted. The weapon didn't just fire, it detonated. The uncalibrated tungsten blast tore through the cage's roof, the kinetic recoil splitting the deck plates beneath Thrain's feet. The massive spread of high-velocity slugs shattered the central gear of the iris valve just as it was about to lock. The iron leaves of the valve buckled outward under the pressure of the rising fluid. allowing the capsule to burst through the wreckage and skyrocket into the high-pressure refinery pools of the upper spire. Act 3. The Threshold of the Spires. The capsule crashed out of the pipe's mouth, tumbling onto a pristine white porcelain deck flooded with 3 inches of draining crimson slurry. The environment had changed instantly. The industrial roar of the lower blocks was gone, replaced by the sterile, echoing silence of the high spires. The walls here were made of elegant, rib-shaped black titanium, looking down over the vast processing floor. Valen was the first to his feet, his Sunder hammer dripping with the red residue of the climb. He wiped his primary optical visor, looking across the chamber. They had bypassed the main security grids, but the cost was visible. Sabine's small squad of rebels was shivering, their light flak jackets soaked in the warm, copper-scented fluid. Cassian was on his knees, his hands trembling as he stared at the ornate, white porcelain statues of the Directorate's founding directors that lined the walls. "We are inside the High Matrix," Sabine wheezed, cleaning her rebreather. "The Weaver chambers are directly above this refinery pool, but look at the conduits." Valen followed her gaze. Running from the massive pools were thousands of smaller, crystal-clear glass tubes. Inside those tubes, the refined biological fluid was no longer red. It had been filtered, electrified, and converted into a glowing, silver-blue plasma. That plasma was being pumped upward, feeding directly into the mechanical joints and neural cores of thousands of dormant iron-skinned soldiers hanging from the ceiling like cocoons. The station wasn't just casting soldiers, it was animating them in real time using the distilled life force they had just ridden through the pipes. "They aren't building an army," Valen rumbled, his mechanical voice synthesizer dropping into a grim, terrifying register. "They are casting a singular, interconnected mind. Every soldier they build is a finger on the Auditor's hand." Deep within the chamber's automated audio emitters, a soft, fractured whisper drifted down to them. Lyra's voice, weaker now but distinct. "The furnace is full, Commander, but the doors are open. Hurry!" Valen raised his hammer, the stolen energy cell crackling with a vicious, unstable blue light. He looked back at the bloody, fanatical faces of his squad and the pale, desperate rebels behind them. "Fix your seals," Valen ordered, his boots crunching heavily on the porcelain tile as he headed for the central lift. "The next floor is where we take her back." Chapter 4. The Weaver Siege. Act 1. The Porcelain Breach. The elevator doors didn't slide open. Valen's Sunder hammer tore them off their hydraulic tracks. The squad and Sabine's remaining rebels spilled onto the pristine white porcelain floor of the Grand Spire. The air here was dead silent, smelling intensely of ozone and liquid silver. In the center of the massive, cathedral-like amphitheater, the quicksilver sphere of the Weaver Matrix rotated on a frictionless axis, its metallic fluids pulsing to the frantic rhythm of Lyra's failing heart. "Intruders," the High Auditor's voice echoed through the Vox emitters, completely devoid of surprise. She stood on the high observation dais, surrounded by 30 fully active iron-skinned guards. "A predictable, highly inefficient expenditure of biological mass. You have ruined perfectly calibrated armor to die on our floor." "We didn't come to argue metrics, Auditor," Valen rumbled, his gunmetal chassis locking into a heavy combat stance. "Form a perimeter," Sabine screamed, her rebels dropping behind the base of ornate porcelain pillars, leveling their heavy rivet guns and scavenged kinetic rifles. "Keep those iron bastards off the knights." With a synchronized mechanical click, the 30 iron-skinned guards raised their high-velocity flechette carbines. The battle for the spires began not with a roar, but with the terrifying high-frequency hiss of thousands of needle-thin metal slivers tearing through the air. Act 2. The Fanatic Shield. The tactical situation was brutal. The iron-skinned moved with a hive-mind synchronization, flanking the rebels' positions with mathematical precision. A hail of flechettes chewed through a porcelain pillar, collapsing it onto two rebel gunners. "We can't advance," Thrain bellowed, his massive slab shield sparking violently as he absorbed a heavy concentrated volley. "The crossfire is too tight. I can't deploy the forearm cannon without exposing my power link." "Cassian!" Valen roared over the noise. "The western flank!" Night Scribe Cassian didn't look for cover. His bloodshot eyes were fixed entirely on the quicksilver sphere where Lyra hung. The religious fervor that had broken his compliance collar was now an absolute, blinding madness. "The saint looks upon us," Cassian shrieked, his voice cracking through the comms. He lunged forward, using the stolen industrial plasma cutter to ignite a ruptured fuel line along the floor. A towering wall of bright orange chemical fire erupted between the rebels and the main line of iron-skinned guards. The extreme heat distorted the guards' optical tracking lenses, causing their defensive volleys to drift wide. Cassian charged through the fire, his new gray armor blackened by the soot. He didn't fire a weapon. He used his own body as a kinetic battering ram, slamming into the leading trio of machine soldiers and dragging them over the edge of the processing platform into the white-hot refinery pools below. "Now, Thrain," Valen ordered. With the guards' line broken by Cassian's suicidal charge, Thrain stepped out from behind his shield. He leveled his massive, uncalibrated kinetic cannon at the structural pillars supporting the Auditor's high dais. Thoom, thoom. The tungsten buckshot didn't just shatter the porcelain casing, it pulverized the structural titanium ribs beneath. The entire observation balcony groaned, buckling violently and tilting 45 degrees, throwing the High Auditor and her personal guard down onto the main combat floor. Act 3, severing the silver cord. Valen moved like a falling avalanche. He ignored the falling debris, his gunmetal boots shattering the tiles as he reached the base of the Weaver Matrix. The High Auditor scrambled up from the wreckage, her brass mask cracked, revealing a cold, cybernetic eye beneath. She leveled a sleek plasma pistol at Valen's head. "If you disrupt the Matrix, her mind collapses. The feedback will lobotomize every sector navigation relay." "Good," Valen rasped. He didn't swing at the Auditor. He swung at the primary titanium power conduits feeding the quicksilver sphere. The Sunder hammer hit the cables with a full gravity strike. A blinding flash of blue-white electrical arcing erupted, melting the floor and throwing the Auditor backward into the shattered glass. The magnetic fields holding the quicksilver sphere died instantly. The massive ball of liquid metal collapsed, spilling millions of gallons of heavy, reflective silver across the white floor like a tidal wave. Suspended by the thousands of microfilaments, Lyra dropped. Valen lunged forward, his massive, heavy gauntlets catching her frail, ghostly white body before she hit the toxic, silver-flooded deck. The spider silk wires snapped one by one, sparking with residual psychic energy. Lyra gasping for air, her silver-stained eyes rolling back into her head as she clutched Valen's gunmetal breastplate with bleeding fingers. "Commander," she whispered, her voice no longer a synthesized station echo, but the fragile, terrified voice of a girl. The core, it's turning off. They're waking up." The entire moon-sized station suddenly shuddered. The sterile, omnipresent hum of the Aethel-Cradle pitch dropped into a low, dying groan. Down below, the millions of souls in the stasis grid were losing their power draw. The lights across the high spire flickered, shifting from cold white to a deep, emergency blood red. Sabine limped over, her scattergun smoking, looking at the structural chaos around them. "The orbital shields are down, Commander, and our sensors just picked up a massive gravitational spike in the lower sector." Valen looked up through the grand glass ceiling of the spire. Out in the black void of space, the dying star was disappearing. A continent-sized shadow was tearing its way out of the vacuum. The hyper-evolved bio-dreadnought of the Bleed had arrived, drawn by the massive death cry of the Matrix. The organic swarm was opening its miles-wide maw, preparing to swallow the powerless station whole. Valen pulled Lyra tight against his chassis, his remaining organic eye fixed on the cosmic nightmare descending upon them. "Cassian, Thrain, to the hangar bays," Valen commanded, his heavy voice echoing in the red dark. "The Directorate is dead. The harvest is over. Now we fight our way out of the womb." Chapter 5. The Hangar Run. Act 1. The Shattered Gantries. The Aethel-Cradle was tearing itself apart from the inside out. Without the central magnetic stabilization fields of the Weaver Matrix, the station's structural artificial gravity began to fluctuate wildly, shifting from weightless drifting to bone-crushing pressure in a matter of seconds. The red emergency lights cast a bloody, rhythmic strobing over Hangar Bay 9, a 3-mile-wide cavern hanging over the black vacuum of space. "The doors won't open manually," Sabine shouted over the roaring wind, her boots slipping on the slick titanium floor as a sudden gravity dip made her momentarily weightless. "The primary pressure seal is locked tight." "Cassian, secure the ship," Valen commanded, his heavy gunmetal boots locking into the deck, using their emergency magnetic clamps. In his massive cast-iron arms, he held Lyra close. The girl's eyes were wide, glassy, reflecting the chaotic dance of white-hot magnesium sparks falling from the ceiling gantries. Her skin was freezing to the touch, her nervous system shivering from the violent psychic withdrawal of being ripped from the station's core. "The Directorate's evacuation shuttle is on Pad 3, Cassian yelled back, his blackened armor trailing gray smoke as he ran toward the low, angular steel vessel. "The fuel cells are cycling, but the docking clamps are fused by the power surge." Above them, the grand glass ceiling of the hangar gave way. Audio cue, a terrifying crystalline crack that cascades into a deafening roar as a 300-foot panel of reinforced viewport glass shatters into the vacuum. The decompression atmospheric pull was immediate, screaming like a dying god. A tempest of loose industrial crates, broken welding drones, and unanchored metal plates was sucked out into the blackness of space. Sabine's rebels scrambled, screaming as they chained themselves to the heavy structural pillars with wire tethers. But the vacuum wasn't the only thing that entered through the breach. Act 2. The Swarm on the Threshold. Through the shattered ceiling drifted the vanguard of the Bleed. They were biomechanical nightmares, creatures of chitin and calcified bone, their bodies pulsing with an unholy bioluminescent yellow light. They didn't fly. They drifted on localized biogravitational sacks, their multi-jointed scythe limbs twitching as they caught the scent of the organic biomass inside the hangar. "They're coming for the girl," Thrain bellowed. He stepped into the gap beneath the ceiling breach, his massive slab shield slammed into the deck plates, creating an immovable iron wall between the falling monsters and the evacuation shuttle. "Commander, get her on board," Thrain roared, his uncalibrated forearm cannon whining as the internal capacitors filled to maximum capacity. "I'll hold the line." 3 of the bio-monsters dropped directly onto Thrain's shield, their jagged bone scythes screaming as they scored deep, white grooves into the metal. The sheer kinetic weight of the impact forced Thrain down onto one knee, the iron joints of his leg plates popping and hissing as they fought the pressure. "Too heavy to run," Thrain muttered through his vocal vox, his voice dropping into a flat, peaceful rumble, "but just right for a wall." He fired the forearm cannon point-blank into the cluster. The uncalibrated tungsten blast didn't just shred the three monsters. The explosive back pressure blew out the remaining structural supports of the overhead gantry. A 50-ton block of solid iron plating collapsed from above, pinning Thrain beneath its weight, locking his chassis immovably to the deck floor. "Thrain!" Cassian screamed from the shuttle's boarding ramp. "Move, scribe!" Thrain's voice crackled over the comms, breaking through the static of the decompression storm. "The shield is locked. They have to come through me." From his pinned position, Thrain continued to fire, his weapon a continuous, rhythmic thunder that turned the narrow hangar neck into a meat grinder of shattered chitin and yellow biofluid. He wasn't defending an empire anymore. He was defending the exit. Act 3. The Last Gatekeeper. Valen reached Pad 3, skidding across the frosted deck as the atmospheric pressure continued to drop. He threw Lyra into the open airlock of the shuttle, where Sabine caught her, dragging her into the pressurized cabin. "The docking clamps are still holding us," Sabine yelled from the control console, her fingers flying over the alien directorate interfaces. "We can't break free. We're going to burn the engines out." Valen turned back to the hangar floor. The swarm was bypassing Thrain's pinned position, crawling along the walls and ceiling like an army of mechanical spiders, their yellow eyes fixed on the shuttle. "Cassian," Valen said, his deep baritone completely steady inside the neural link. "Take the helm." "Commander, no," Cassian whispered, his visor flaring. "The liturgy. The crusade isn't finished. We are the spear." "The crusade is her," Valen interrupted, pointing his massive gauntlet toward Lyra inside the ship. "The king is dead, Cassian. The throne is dust, but the child lives. Protect the lineage." Before the young night scribe could protest, Valen grabbed him by his neck plate and threw him backward into the shuttle's airlock, hitting the emergency cycle button. The heavy steel door slid shut, locking Cassian inside the hull. Valen turned to face the oncoming swarm. His Sunder hammer was dead, its power cell completely drained by the breach of the Matrix. He let the legendary weapon drop, its heavy iron head hitting the deck with a dull, hollow thud. He didn't need it anymore. He had 900 pounds of Directorate iron, a heart full of centuries of warfare, and a promise made to a dying star. "Come on then, you bastards," Valen growled, his Vox emitter crackling into a terrifying, animalistic roar. He lunged at the main docking clamp assembly, a massive three-pronged iron talon that held the shuttle's tail to the pad. He wrapped his heavy gray arms around the hydraulic piston, his internal actuators screaming as he drew upon the absolute maximum output of his cybernetic core. "Warning, core overheat detected. Energy output, 140%. Internal temperature, risk of critical meltdown." The biomonsters hit him from behind. Jagged bone scythes tore into his exposed shoulder joints. Yellow bioacid sprayed across his breastplate, eating through the stamped serial number, Unit 01EGVAELEN. He didn't let go. He didn't look back. With a final desperate burst of brute kinetic force, Valen sheared the hydraulic piston in half. The docking clamps shattered into flying shrapnel. Free of its anchors, the evacuation shuttle's engines flared into a blinding, blue-white chemical roar, lifting off the pad and rocketing out through the shattered ceiling into the safety of the void. Valen watched the ship go, its small tail lights disappearing into the starry dark of the cosmos. The swarm completely covered him then, a shifting, snapping mountain of white bone and yellow light. But as his optical visor was crushed into darkness, Valen felt no cold iron. For the first time in 200 years, he felt the warm, golden sun of the old empire shining on his face. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Drift. Act 1. The Quiet Void. The Aethel-Cradle did not die with a sound. In the vacuum of the deep frontier, the detonation of a world-sized furnace was a silent, beautiful horror. Inside the cockpit of the slate-gray Directorate transport, Night Scribe Cassian kept his hands locked onto the manual thruster yokes. His visor was cracked, his breathing a dry, mechanical rattle that echoed hollowly in the quiet cabin. Behind him, through the massive plasteel viewport, a miniature sun bloomed in the dark, a blinding white flash of pure plasma fire that expanded outward, incinerating the local docking blocks and the undulating, purple-veined mass of the Bleed's primary hive ship alike. The shockwave hit them a second later. The ship groaned, its iron rib walls vibrating like a struck bell, but the hull held. The sublight thrusters hummed a steady, vibrating pitch as the vessel drifted away from the ash field, plunging deep into the featureless black of the outer slipstream. "The external sensors are clear," Sabine said softly from the navigation console. She had removed her tattered flak jacket, exposing the raw, greasy bandages wrapping her ribs. Her face was pale, her flint-hard eyes staring blankly at the empty radar grid. "We're past the gravity well. There's nothing behind us but dust." Cassian did not answer. He slowly released his grip on the yokes, his heavy cast-iron fingers clicking as they relaxed. He looked down at his armor plates. The brass trimmings of the Sovereignty were gone, replaced entirely by the cold, unyielding gunmetal gray of the Directorate's machine men. They had escaped the meat grinder. They had broken their chains, but the cost was carved directly into their bones. Act 2. The Quicksilver Inheritance. Cassian unbuckled his magnetic harness and stepped into the transport's primary cargo hold. Of the 5,000 human guerrillas who had fought in the dark layers of the cradle, only 14 remained alive inside the ship. They sat huddled together on piles of scavenged canvas, their pale, lightless faces stained with oil and grease, their old kinetic rifles resting uselessly between their knees. They did not celebrate. They did not pray. They simply stared at the floor plates with the hollow, vacant eyes of ghosts. In the corner of the hold, resting on a bed of insulated wiring, sat Lyra. The silver formatting fluid of the matrix had finally dried, leaving her skin a smooth, translucent white that looked like carved marble. She was no longer shivering. She sat perfectly still, her small, fragile hands resting in her lap, her head tilted toward the low ceiling as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. "Acolyte," Cassian said, kneeling heavily before her. The iron joints of his new knees let out a sharp, mechanical hiss in the quiet room. "The commander, Valen, he gave you the sky. We are clear of the frontier." Lyra slowly turned her head. When her face caught the dim red light of the emergency lamps, Cassian's optical sensors suffered a violent static flicker. Her eyes were no longer human. The deep, psychic violet of her old lineage was gone, replaced entirely by a smooth, reflective, mirror-like quicksilver, the permanent, unerasable seal of the Weaver matrix. "The sky is an illusion, Scribe," Lyra whispered, her silver lips barely moving. "The navigation tracks are locked, Lyra," Sabine said, stepping down from the cockpit ladder, her double-barreled scattergun resting against her hip. "We're heading toward the core worlds of the Sovereignty. The main fleets are stationed there. We'll find a sanctuary." "There are no sanctuaries left in the dark," Lyra said. She slowly raised her left hand, her fingers twitching in a bizarre mathematical sequence, the exact same mechanical rhythm the iron-skinned guards had used when moving in their hive-mind phalanx. Cassian watched her hand, a cold, long-forgotten dread rising behind his amber visor plates. "Lyra, what did you see before the Matrix died?" Act 3. The Map to the Slaughter. "The Director General didn't build the Legion to fight the Swarm, Cassian," Lyra murmured, her quicksilver eyes reflecting the cracked visor of the scribe. He built them because he understood the true logic of the universe. He understood that the flesh is a beacon. She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a chilling, harmonious whisper that didn't travel through the air, but erupted directly inside every Vox headset and internal audio buffer on the ship simultaneously. The bleed does not hunt by sight. It does not hunt by biomass. It hunts by thought. Every time a human soul calls out to the saint, every time a psychic node navigates a ship through the void, it creates a ripple in the deep vacuum. The sovereignty's faith is not a shield. It is a lighthouse in a galaxy of predators. Cassian's breath hitched in his throat. The ancient liturgies he had copied for centuries, the prayers of the steady hand, the songs of the righteous descent, suddenly felt like a death sentence. When I was wired into the Weaver matrix, Lyra continued, a single heavy tear of pure liquid silver rolling down her marble cheek, I wasn't just navigating the station. To maintain the logical balance, they hooked my brain into the primary communication relays of the outer frontier. They wired me into the collective consciousness of every soul being processed in the sublevels. She stopped, the silver tear hitting Cassian's gunmetal breastplate with a soft metallic tink. The shock wave of their pain, the collective scream of 4 million souls when the commander broke the conduits. It was too loud, Scribe. It tore the veil wide open. I didn't just speak to the station. I spoke to them. Outside the viewport, the clean, starry dark of the void began to curdle, shifting into an ugly, bruised violet. They heard me, Lyra whispered, her quicksilver eyes widening with an absolute, vacant terror. The bleed knows where we are going. It doesn't just see this ship, because my mind was linked to the inner sanctum relays before the cradle died. I gave them the map. I gave them the frequencies to every holy world on the frontier. A sudden, violent alarm blared from the cockpit console. Warning, disruption, detected. Massive, extra-dimensional specimens ahead. Cassian lunged back to the cockpit viewport, his iron boots denting the deck plates. Through the swirling, violent energy of the deep drift, they were no longer alone. Traveling alongside their shuttle, running parallel to their sublight trajectory within the literal shadow of the void, were hundreds of massive, undulating silhouettes, the continent-sized bio-dreadnoughts of the Bleed, riding the very warp-wake their ship was leaving behind. The monsters weren't chasing them, they were following them home. Cassian looked at his heavy cast-iron hands, then down at the stamped Directorate serial number on his chest. They had preserved the lineage. They had saved the child. But in doing so, they had become the vanguard for the end of the galaxy. "Scribe," Sabine whispered, her face completely bloodless as she stared out at the shadows swimming in the dark. "What do we do?" Cassian gripped the steering yoke, the hydraulic pumps in his wrists clicking in the red dark as the ship plunged deeper into the violet fog, leading the Harvest toward the heart of the Empire. "We ride the line," Cassian rumbled, his voice losing its youthful franticness, dropping into the dark, uncompromising baritone of his fallen commander. "We warn the sanctum, and then we give them an iron skin." End of Book 2.